It is Beltane, May 1st, 2024. Hello, everyone. This is the debut of my new podcast, The Witching Hour is Nigh. Welcome. I'm so glad you're here. I am Peg Aloi, and my guest today, my first guest on my first episode of my first podcast, is Kate Laity, who's a good friend. We've known each other for quite some time. We are both very, very interested in witches, witchcraft, the occult, paganism, and how they're represented throughout popular culture. So we hope to have an interesting conversation today. And with no further ado, I'd like to have Kate say hello.
Hello.
There she is. Should we mention how we met?
Did we meet at Harvard?
We did.
Oh, you want me to tell the story?
You can. Well, so my friend Hannah and I, we co-organized a conference at Harvard. I just went up and asked if we could do it. Yeah, God, it was 2005, the first one. It's a long time ago. And we did a conference called Charming and Crafty, which had to do with the portrayal of witchcraft and witches and folklore in popular culture. And we got all kinds of really interesting talks and presentations, and Kate Laity's was one of them. I don't remember what you spoke on now, though.
Finnish charm songs.
That's right. And you sang.
I brought my kantala and I sang.
It was so cool. That was actually one of the coolest presentations that we had, because it was just so dynamic.
Because I don't usually sing in public.
And then we realized when I moved to Albany, then we realized we lived near each other, so we started hanging out and became like movie buddies and like all that kind of thing. And
we have seen many movies.
We have. The rest is history. And some of them have been good, and some of them not so good. And Kate lives half the year in the UK, so we're about to bid her farewell for the summer, for a little while, which is always sad. But through the magic of technology and social media, we can all stay in touch. Would you like to tell anyone about anything that you're working on, or how they can see your stuff online, or any of that?
They can find whatever I am up to on my website at KALAITY.com. And I'm in a moment of transition, because I'm about to stop being an academic and become, I don't know, my final form. No, probably not my final form, but my next form, which will probably involve quite a bit of magic. Mm-hmm. Because, transformations always require magic.
So mote it be. Without getting too deeply into it, Kate is one of a number of people who, at a local campus who, they're not being done well by, let's just put it that way. But you know what? Life is change, and no matter what your situation, life can always change on a dime. And I think we all need to be prepared for that every day. So I know that Kate is going to muster all the courage and tenacity that she has, which she has in large amounts. And I'm sure she's going to go on and do really great things. And, I know it's a cliche, but when a door closes, a window opens, or it better anyway.
Or a small crack into a subterranean cave.
Well,
as the case may be.
We're going to watch your adventures, because I'm sure you're going to be a guest on the podcast more than once. So.
Well, and an important thing to remember, too, is that one of the best ways to withstand the problems of change is to always make sure you have a good network of support.
Absolutely.
Because you can't rely on it in this country. So make sure you have a personal web of support.
That's really true. The social safety net, I think we like to assume it's always going to be there for us. But I think, as we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years,
it can be withdrawn quickly.
It can be withdrawn at the drop of a hat, and there's definitely people out there struggling who have witnessed that firsthand. So you're absolutely right. It pays to be self-reliant, but also to build up a support network around you, much like, perhaps one could say, a coven of support. Just trying to bring it back to the topic at hand. So, Kate and I were trying to figure out what we might want to talk about for this first episode, and she very wisely, as is her wont, decided that it might be interesting to talk about the fact that in a lot of witchy movies and television and graphic novels and even literary novels, we don't see a lot of attention paid to older women. We see ancient crones and scary old witches and scary old hags and all that kind of thing because that's such a really common stereotype and really common trope in horror generally, but also going back to fairy tales. But in terms of women who are, say, over the age of 45 through maybe 65, that period of time, which is a substantial amount of time, a couple of decades.
And a time of power for a lot of women,
Right.
too.
And a time of achievement and a time of maturation and often a time of change and a time of accomplishment. So it's sort of like, where are those women and where are those witches and why don't we tend to see them? I think that older women, in terms of the connection to witchcraft and witchery and the occult, I have actually recently given a couple of talks on the figure of the hag and the crone in popular culture. I honestly think there's probably a whole book in there, and there's been a couple of books that have come out recently. There's one called Hagitude, and there's another one that just came out of the UK. And sometimes the word hag is used in almost a political context, or it's sort of a social context that doesn't necessarily connect to the image of the witch. I mean, there's sort of a nod or an acknowledgement to the idea that it comes from this image of an old woman who uses magic or a woman who's accused of witchcraft or what have you. But the idea of an older woman who has left behind certain aspects of her existence, like this idea that older women are no longer sexually viable, older women are no longer in the workplace, or they don't occupy as important a place in the workplace as they once did. Older women, if they are not actively engaged in child rearing in some capacity or some aspect of mothering, are somehow no longer useful. So, and of course, people have heard of this trope of the invisible older woman. Well, Kate and I are very, very much visible in the world. We're here. We're solid. We're here to stay for a little while anyway. And I think it would be interesting to sort of unpack this notion that films and TV shows and other sorts of texts about witches are either about these very old, scary, ugly, decrepit witches, or they're about young, very young witches in some cases, teenagers, hot witches, sexy witches, or witches in their 20s and 30s who are still obviously, in that realm of being, effable, I guess. I don't know.
But I mean, that's actually a good parallel because so much of this comes from young men who are choosing which products get made in studios.
Yes.
And they don't find any interest in older women. And
Right.
they don't find any interest in anything but the cute young witches. And so it's hard to there aren't very many of them that are going to be interested in things like that. And it's
Right.
a couple of the ones that really sort of immediately popped into my mind now that we're actually talking about it, as opposed to before this when we were preparing. Sylvia Townsend Warner's Lolly Willows. Wouldn't that be a great film? Wouldn't that be a great film?
And
there's
hasn't
an
it been?
older woman. And I think because the book itself has sort of fallen out of consciousness until fairly recently. And I mean, in recent years, I know that sort of, now that people are sort of looking in a different historical sense at the early 20th century, that kind of modernist writer that at the time, the sort of contemporaries like Virginia Woolf, they were very realistic. And so her more sort of, I hate to call it fantasy tinged because it's very much realism, and the magic that creeps into it feels very real as well too. So it's very much in the same kind of mood as the other modernist writers, but it just happens to deal with a woman who decides to become a witch, and a woman of a certain age, and a woman who is dealing with her family, thinking of her as someone who's there to be either free labor or in the way. And she decides to go off into the country on her own and just be a witch.
I haven't read it, but I was introduced to this novel, and I actually got a copy and sitting in my to be read pile as without so many others.
Move it up. It's,
Yeah,
it's
oh,
really,
yeah.
really good.
Well, I think there was someone, I'm actually currently editing an anthology on women and folk horror. That Kate is also contributing.
That's right. That's right.
There was someone who wanted to talk about Lolly Willows in that collection, and also, and things keep happening. Like I decided on what the chapters were going to be, and someone's doing a chapter on Starvacre, the short story. But now, lo and behold, there is a film made of Starvacre, which I saw at the London Film Festival last fall, but it's not going to be released until October. So, but the Lolly Willows thing, it when I first heard about it, I was like, oh my God, this sounds fascinating. I have to read it. But I have to say, things written, as you were saying, things written in that era, I think it's a real, almost an act of defiance at this point for someone to want to develop that as a cinematic property. And there has to be a real vision behind it, because otherwise everything is just all reboots or retreads, or it's just a take on the same old kind of storyline that one has already seen 100 times. So bringing back some of these literary properties, I think would be a great idea to kind of explore some of these modes that we're talking about. This idea of an older woman, and how is that different? How is the story of witchcraft, as expressed by a mature woman, how does that land differently? Not just with audiences, but also just in, the cinematic or the literary milieu. Like, how is that just a different kind of a vibe that's out there? We were talking earlier about two of our favorite characters, Auntie Zelda and Auntie Hilda in The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which I actually think is a pretty great show. I
love it.
I love it too. I didn't like it. You're in fact writing about it for the collection, which is great.
I'm writing about the landscape in it.
It's such a gorgeous series. Just from a design perspective, it has an amazing cast. I don't think it certainly didn't end as well as it might have. It ended rather abruptly, and I think because it was going to be canceled, and that happens. But I've read the first edition of the graphic novel it's based on, which is also really brilliant, and there's quite a lot in there that's not actually in the show.
And quite different in style too.
It is. It really is. But I thought it was really well done. I thought there was a lot of really intriguing.
And they listened to their audience. I thought that was one of the really interesting things that they responded to, and that some of the criticisms about it, because it was so completely, in part because it was coming from this graphic novel that was very rooted in the old 1950s, early 60s horror comics, where it was definitely sort of witchcraft as Satanism, and that a lot of people in actual practicing witches were kind of like, well, that's a very limited vision of what witchcraft is. Right. And they actually opened it out in like the next series. It was a much different thing, where instead of it was the central sort of conflict within it was between Sabrina and the Dark Lord.
Right.
That it becomes a much more complicated and interesting story, and that there's much beyond sort of the traditional satanic witchcraft into very different kinds of worship, and different kinds of populations too, because we have the pagans coming in later too, who are also very different from modern pagans, but also borrowing on a lot of the same tropes. And then of course the women in the hills, the other witches,
all the witches.
There were all kinds of things there that they did in interesting ways. And it was a shame they had to kind of curtail it suddenly, and then sort of cosmic
And then
horror.
speaking of listening to the audience, their whole thing about like we're endgame, and when Sabrina responds to like, well, you said we're endgame, because of course endgame was the word being bandied about on social media about Sabrina and Nick, the boyfriend there.
Oh, yes.
I interviewed him, actually.
Did you?
He was really nice. He was a real sweetheart. He's really funny. He had quite an interesting childhood. But going back to what you're saying about how that got opened up into more types of witchcraft, more types of paganism, that also allowed the storylines to embrace more of the women and more of the female characters. An interesting way, like having all those different witches like Gryla and Pesta and some of these other ones to come into the story, having those the pagan women who were almost based on these sort of goddess-like figures, like Arachne, things like that. The one that was like the Spider Woman, the one that interacted with snakes, and of course that whole storyline being somewhat drawn from other films and properties like The Wicker Man, but I think it was very open that it was doing that. I don't think it was trying to,
yes, there was always
sneaky.
a nod to popular culture sources,
Definitely.
and used in a way that it was clear that they're saying to the audience, we know you know this, so we're using it and taking it in a fun way, in the same way like incorporating Dorian Gray.
Oh, yeah.
And so other figures like that, and Caliban. I couldn't stand the character.
No, the Caliban character. Oh my God.
But the idea of Caliban, that was a very interesting aspect.
The fact
to
that
bring
she marries him in another a parallel world of existence. Oh, sorry. If you haven't seen it, you need to get on that right away.
You're gonna have to, and on streaming, because it's still not available on disc.
It really needs to be made available on physical media, because that's one that really could just be watched again and again, because it is really wonderful, especially the first 3 seasons. I also really liked that the relationship between the two sisters, who are both about 300 years old apparently, because the Spellman family ages rather slowly. But the fact that there's this, in the first episode, you see this thing where Zelda gets sort of irritated with Hilda and like hits her over the head with a shovel, and she dies, and then she's just kind of, she's buried in the earth, and she comes back to life immediately. And then we see much later, there's an episode where this same kind of thing happens, where Hilda has to be resurrected, but instead of it just being a thing she can do all on her own, she needs the help of an entire coven of witches. And it's a circle of women. And then what I really love about that scene, actually, is they have all these women witches that are all holding hands and using their power. And then the men folk, for lack of a better term, are standing on the periphery, and they're also lending their magical power. And it's actually a really gorgeous scene. It's very, very powerful. But that connection between the two sisters, and how it's almost like they are representative of this womanly witchcraft through the ages, this idea of connection to nature, and this idea of the bonding together of power. In other words, you're stronger as a group than you are by yourself. And just a lot of really beautiful themes that come out there.
And that there are different kinds of ways to approach magic, that it doesn't all have to be sort of one iconic way.
Right.
And that you, in the same way with every other skill, you work to your strengths, and you'll be drawn to a different part of it than someone else is. Another one of the sort of, what I would think of, middle-aged witches that, again, not very popular, but the 1966 Hammer film, The Witches, which, if you get the Blu-ray, don't even bother listening to the commentary, because it is awful, awful. It just irks me so much, because I love this film. And I've been talking about it at a couple of conferences recently.
Why don't they ask you to do some commentary on these films? Why don't they ask me? Where's the good commentary?
They asked some film bro who clearly knew nothing about the film,
so annoying.
Knew nothing about the sources for it, and knew nothing, and thought that Joan Fontaine at 49 was really old.
Oh, for Pete's
and that
sake.
The character's really old in the novel too. She's 44 in the novel, so she's not really old. But there's a lot of it. It's very sexist, but it's just a lot of it is like really cringy, because, I mean, one of the reasons this film is not popular is because modern dance. The talk I gave just recently, this was a big part of it, is like the ritual incorporates modern dance, and horror film fans, especially in 1966, saw this and they were like, what's going on here?
Oh, no.
I don't get that. This is strange. And there's a moment even where it looks like two guys are kissing too. So it's like a lot of things that are sort of in that ritual moment where it really gives this sense of all the barriers are gone, and we're really concerned with creating this kind of raising of magic. And there's a lot of interesting things in the film, but the central, there's two witch figures, actually. There's the sort of, we look like at one point it's going to be a folk horror film. And of course, this is a movie before the so-called Unholy Trinity.
Oh, right.
So this is an earlier folk horror film. But what it does is it sort of sidesteps away from that. There are some like sharp turns in this film that you can't really foresee, which for me, I think makes it really, really interesting. But it seems like there's the older witch, who's referred to as Granny, and she does the herbal remedies, and she makes it's not dandelion, well, maybe it is dandelion wine, but she makes, the homemade wine, and she makes the herbs, and she has all these practices, and she will tell these things that are sort of like the folklore knowledge. But she's not the real witch. The real witch is the one that's hiding as the respectable, very middle class witch, Stephanie Baxter,
right?
Who is a writer, and she writes for the Sunday, supplements, and she's, when our main character, played by Joan Fontaine, she's like, oh, we should write together about this idea of witchcraft and how women of a certain age are always interested in it because they're losing their power.
Oh,
and it's like, it's clear that the power that they have is only sexual power,
right?
But Stephanie is using sort of the folk horror elements within that little village, in the West, in the sort of unclear place somewhere in the west of England. But she's doing her research. She's looked up Brother Johann's necromantic book from I think she says it's the 15th century. So she's using these elements from a Mexican ritual that comes straight out of the Golden Bough, Fraser's The Golden Bough, and including a ritual knife. And her ritual garb actually has this image of the corn goddess on it.
That's right.
And she has a headpiece that is like hands of glory and antlers, and so it's like it's this weird mishmash of things. But then we have the modern dance and the ritual with these sort of wonderfully faked sort of Western occult symbols on the floor. It's all a very interesting mix, but it is all about this idea of the middle-aged women, both as sort of this woman seeking power, which is clearly in the film quoted as wrong thing to do. So Stephanie is wrong, but also the older woman who is more nurturing and more caring and more, but also very much the Jessica Fletcher of trying to get to the bottom of things. The Joan Fontaine character, who is the one who can save everybody too.
So this idea of the idea that women who are older would seek out witchcraft because they feel like they are no longer powerful enough. They're
clearly
losing
comes
their
from
power. Right, exactly. But it's interesting to me because there's sort of a dichotomy going on there. The dichotomy is that in films about teenage witches, that's also about these girls coming into power, coming into either magical power,
terror of women's power,
sexual power, and so that's all about, of course, puberty and adolescent sexuality, and this idea that teenage girls who don't necessarily feel like they have a lot of power in the culture yet, that this power, the fact that the power has to come from witchcraft, but that witchcraft is irrevocably tied to their sexual maturation as well. And when they're coming into their power, it also means they're coming into womanhood. And so that's why there's so many tropes in some of these films that have to do with things like menstruation or loss of virginity or, things like this. So it's
really down to this kind of gender essentialism that women are just their bodies and they're just their biological functions.
It's amazing. But, this is why I liked also what you were saying about the fact that you have this character, Stephanie, who sort of more or less is kind of hiding the fact that she's a witch because she has this, quote, real, unquote job as a writer, but
not even a job, because she's clearly wealthy. She and her brother live in this big house that's sort of the manor that the little town is built around. Right. So she's a leisure writer. She enjoys writing because she enjoys sort of digging into subjects. But it's very much this sort of very middle class English kind of. I like to do this sort of as a hobby. I'm very interested in many things and write about them for the Sunday supplements.
It's almost a topic for another podcast episode. This idea that like witchcraft as an economic choice or witchcraft as an economic endeavor. But I wanted to mention too, since we were talking about the ants in Sabrina, there are two ants in the novel Practical Magic.
Oh yeah.
Jet and Fran. who in the novel, I mean, I really like the way they're portrayed in the novel, but in the novel, they have no dialogue. There's no written dialogue, and they're portrayed as quite old and quite frail in a way. You know, the ants, and then once in a while there'd be a mention of something they did in their younger days, you know. But when the film came out, the film very much gives these characters a lot of life and certainly a lot of dialogue.
Oh, yeah. Great actors.
And great actors, you know, by Diane Wiest and Stockard Channing. I mean, it doesn't get any
They're
better than
fabulous.
that. They're incredible. And they also have this whole thing with making the midnight margaritas, which, by the way, not in the novel if you haven't read it. I actually I always consider the fact that Zelda's always drinking really good scotch in Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. I consider that a nod to the midnight margaritas thing. But I love that the ants are really given such color and such life in the film. And to the point where, we were talking about this earlier, Alice Hoffman has, of course, written 2 sequel novels, perhaps based on the fact that this film was so successful, that go back in time to when the ants were younger. When Franny and Jet were the age of Jillian and Sally, you know, who are in their, you know, we see them in their teenage years and then their 20s and then their 30s. And this is quite interesting. So in their Magic Lessons was the third one, and the Rules of Magic is the second one. There's some really interesting stuff. I thought the Rules of Magic was being made into a series.
It might be.
If it
sounds like
it's on hold. Yeah, or maybe the writer's strike might have had something to do with it.
A lot of things derailed during
absolutely
during the worst of COVID.
But you know, sometimes witchy things start to get made and then they just kind of disappear. Like, I don't know if you remember Genji Kohan, who did Orange is the New Black, and before that did Weeds. These are both great shows. Genji Kohan was working on a series called The Devil You Know, starring Eddie Izzard, when Eddie Izzard was called Eddie Izzard, and I forget who the actress was, but they basically filmed the whole first season, or at least the pilot and a couple of episodes, and then the whole project was canceled, strangely. But it was set in Salem during the witch trials, and it was sort of this kind of like comedy/drama, you know, full of sex and intrigue. I mean, I'm sure it would have been amazing, but the fact that it didn't see the light of day. I'm sure it's out there somewhere. Maybe you can see a bit of it because they did make some episodes, but
they should leak these. Somebody should always leak these series when they cancel them.
Absolutely.
Because I mean, the ridiculous reasons for, you know, these idiots in charge of, I don't care who knows it. I think they're idiots. Idiots who are in charge of these things are just like, well, let's see, we don't think we can make a go of this, so we'll just cancel it. And it's right. You know, you remember back in the days where people who created movies actually were interested in creating movies and releasing movies. Yeah. And not just sort of like, well, we could get a tax write-off if we killed this. Let's kill it.
This whole thing now where it's just about
all the creativity goes into accounting instead of into the actual films that they create.
What is that about? I just remember reading about...
It's about rich people never being rich enough.
Oh, God. It's really depressing. I mean, I did a talk on The Wicker Man recently, and I was just delving into some of that history and the publicity around it, and how Christopher Lee, who did not get paid a salary to make this film, he actually did a lot of the PR on his own dime, and did his own traveling on his own dime to promote the film, because the studio absolutely didn't want any part in promoting it, because one doesn't know in the beginning that something's going to become, you know, a cult film. You know, I'd like to talk about, though, it's hardly a cult film. It's actually, I think, considered a horror classic at this point, and has had a couple of reboots, and apparently has another one on the back burner, and which really doesn't need to be done, but there we go, it's happening. And that's Rosemary's Baby, which of course came out also in the 60s, not a folk horror story, but certainly a very, very influential story, one that of course I argue is at the heart of the Satanic Panic. But just like we had these ants, these older ant figures, who are sort of maybe granny-like and quite nurturing in their way, but also have certain mystique happening around them. But in Rosemary's Baby, we have these, once we finally find out that they're witches, they're quite elderly people, and they're quite eccentric, and they're sort of interested in younger people. We later learn they're only interested in these younger people because they want to be able to have an incubator for the child of Satan or what have you. But I think that one of the things that's so successful about this film in terms of why it was so disturbing to people and why I think that led to it being, the imagery from that film being associated with satanic panic kinds of narratives and scenarios, is that you have these dotty old people that just kind of live right next door.
Yeah.
And they make cakes.
The familiarity.
And they have like this
Jack-like
silly
mouse.
Right, exactly. They have silly books in the bathroom and they wear silly clothes and it could be anyone. And that idea that what you were saying earlier also about the character in The Witch is that you could have someone who is a witch who's you just don't know. The idea that someone has to hide that, but also that when a certain moment comes, they reveal that. And what does that moment of revelation mean? Like, what does it mean to have a witch in your midst?
A terrifying older woman.
Exactly. Yeah, like
with power.
I thought
we never thought she had any power.
Exactly. I thought she was just making cookies. I thought she was just, had that nice son-in-law in law school. Right. Well, that's the thing. And so she's not. So this idea that women, are safe, that goes topsy-turvy when she's revealed to be a witch.
How many times have, especially it's usually men, but sometimes women said to you, well, you're kind of intimidating.
Oh, that never happens to me. Oh gosh, or
if
scary,
I had a dime
or
for every
scary.
time, I could retire.
I've had people say I was scary, and I mean, like what does that mean? And not even scary, like, oh, your anger is scary, whatever. There's my dog. That's my dog, Maisie.
Cry.
Oh,
she says, I'm scared.
Oh, no.
I'm scared.
By the way, going forward, this podcast will definitely have a whining dog occasion in the background. Why are you crying? Oh, honey. So, like you, I have been called intimidating and scary. And, and when this happens, it strikes me that it's not because I'm behaving in a particularly scary or intimidating way. It's because I'm speaking. I'm articulating ideas.
Disagreeing.
I'm disagreeing. I am correcting someone because what they have done is they have said something that was not factually correct. I'm suggesting another way of doing something, or I am possibly speaking to my own expertise in something. Like these
or
are
just
the things.
Enthusiastically.
Right.
Enthusiasm is like, ooh, tone it down, girl.
I don't get it. And, I had this conversation with someone recently, and it had to do with how women, are just portrayed in anything, in cinema, in TV, in just in popular culture generally, and how women just can't win. It doesn't matter how you dress. You either dress too frumpy or you dress too sexy. You're either too submissive and quiet and like you're just a little bunny rabbit, or you're an out loud bitch and you're too loud and you're too obnoxious. Like you literally can't win. Or you're stupid, you're like a dumb blonde, or you're just like a dumb bimbo, or you're a know-it-all, or you're bossy, or you literally there's no middle ground that you can occupy. And that's the whole point, because it's an impossibility to occupy that middle ground. And so no matter how you choose to present yourself or what your affect consists of, it's wrong. It's unacceptable.
I think that's a big part of why this particular sort of group of women is left out, because it's very easy to talk about and manipulate young women. And it's very easy to talk about and dismiss old women. But that in between, unless you're a mother and they can somehow, categorize you in that way, if you're just a woman of a certain age, as we euphemistically call it, and you're not easily definable by some socially acceptable role, then you already make people uncomfortable. It's like, what are you? How do I categorize you? People love categorizing. And again, it's important because it's part of how our brain works. Where do I file that information? This category, that category. But it's also important for women because it's that unsettling aspect of being an older woman who's not yet old enough to be sort of written off as the crone. That is it's not disruptive and unsettling to a lot of people.
Yeah. Exactly, and not that a crone should be written off because
No, but it's easy for people with that category. They feel safe. Well, you're
definitely.
You're a granny.
Yeah, or we'll just go ask you a question when we have a specific question, or you're become an oracle of some kind.
The pervasiveness of Robert Graves' maiden mother crone.
Oh yeah.
And it's like, this is not what we need to be.
There needs to be a fourth thing in there, and I remember
we need lots of categories.
Well, yeah,
but
exactly.
But at the very least, it's like there's a lot more to women than maiden mother and crone.
No question. I have to say, I mean, it seems like it was maybe in the 90s. There was this sense of like, it was this thing that was often talked about, like women want to have it all. They want to have marriage and motherhood and a job and a career and hobbies and all these things. And then it became really clear that this was not possible. But it
was another stick to beat women over
the
head with, as, oh, you're just not living up
you're
to.
You're failing. You're not good at everything. But now we have this weird cultural backlash that has to do with attacking women who don't have children. And how you're not.
Wives.
Yeah, and trad wives. And like how you're not fulfilling your destiny of womanhood if you don't have kids. And you are ruining the country because you're not providing like a source of wiry labor, or whatever. And so there's this whole strange, again, thing where women can never get it right. And women are never doing the right thing. And I mean, we don't have time today, obviously, to go
My advice is take up witchcraft.
Take up witchcraft. We don't have time to look at all the ways in which there is this ongoing war on women that never really went away. And how it seems to be getting worse by the day. And I'm sure that's a topic that will come up. But the idea
cultivate your rue.
Yeah, well, yeah, cultivate whatever needs to be cultivated. I mean, we certainly are seeing a lot of emphasis on homesteading and survivalism and prepping and all that kind of thing. I think what needs to be prepped for, quite frankly, is the fact that women are no longer going to be able to safely walk down the street without, I mean, it's already kind of happening on some level, but these things that we're hearing about where women are not being treated in hospitals when they have emergency medical needs. And there's no time to go into it now because it's literally it's 6 episodes minimum about that situation. But this is very much tied to the idea of women's power and women's bodies. And what you were saying earlier, Kate, about how everything about women's usefulness is located in their bodily functions, which is kind of ridiculous, but also the fact that there's so much fear around women's bodily functions. There's so much fear,
ignorance.
Fear and ignorance.
God,
yeah.
You read some of these abortion anti-abortion, pro supposedly life, but they don't know how women's bodies work.
No.
And it's clear when this legislation, I mean, like today the ban in Florida, which takes place, you cannot have an abortion before most people even know they're pregnant because of the way your body works.
No, there's no actual understanding of the biology involved, and there's no interest in the biology. The interest is in control and subjugation and humiliation and domination. And it's because I guess, I don't know, women are just gotten too uppity for their own good, and it's an enormous problem. And I feel like I sound like I'm whining when I talk about it, but I am exhausted by it.
And all the people in 2016 who were telling us, oh, they'll never overturn Roe.
No, they were getting ready to do it, and everyone just walked right into it. Like, oh, Hillary's a bitch. I don't want to vote for her. Well done. Good for you. I'm so glad you stuck to your principles. Anyway, I'm not bitter or anything like that about that. Anyway, this has been a really, really interesting conversation. We've talked about a few things. There's certainly many more older women characters and older witches to talk about, and we're definitely going to be exploring the wide world of witches in literature, witches in cinema, witches in TV, witches in graphic novels, witches in theater, witches in popular culture, as this podcast finds its shape and continues. I'm so glad you were here with us for this first episode. I'd like to say thanks again to my guest, Kate
Thank
Laity.
you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And just to let you know that I will be posting links to these podcast episodes on my blog, which is on Substack at The Media Witch. Feel free to check it out. Thanks again for joining us here at The Witching Hour is Nigh.